Hello and welcome to Voices of the Industry, a podcast series bringing you leading industry voices who challenge thinking across transportation, infrastructure and cities.
We are here today to talk about how we can make more efficient use of our transportation system. How can we encourage people out of their cars and onto bikes, buses, trains, or indeed walking, or perhaps think about the way we change the time that they travel or where they travel to. So it's a question which, having long played on the minds of governments the world over, is seen in a new light in a climate conscious and public health focused post-COVID world. Transportation demand management, as it is known in the US, or behaviour change, as it is more commonly called in the UK, is a way to address this key transport and planning issue in our towns and cities. I'm Lisa Martin, a director at Steer. I've worked in the field of TDM since its infancy in the UK, since the late 1990s. At that time, we were developing and piloting behaviour change strategies. We were drafting best practice guidance on travel plans for clients such as then the Department for Transport and Energy Savings Trust. We led the way in developing personal travelling planning techniques, including motivational interviewing, and we played a key role in the delivery of the Sustainable Travel Towns programme and subsequent local sustainable transport projects. In 2014, I made the move to the United States with a remit to establish Steer's planning business, subsequently opening offices in Los Angeles and San Diego. I've been back working in the UK since 2020, still with a very keen interest in TDM. And with me today is Julia Wean, who I first met in 2017, whom I have enjoyed working with immensely on many TDM challenges over the intervening years. Julia, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm Julia Wean. As Lisa mentioned, I am an associate with Steer. I've been working in the TDM industry since 2012 and with you since 2017, Lisa. I've worked across a few different areas in the industry. I started with a small nonprofit transportation management association in the Boston area, helping to manage TDM programs on the ground. And then now with Steer, my focus is more on the strategic side of TDM, so sort of helping to design TDM strategies and policies for our clients. And it's been really great to work with you and learn from you over the years, Lisa. I think particularly watching how you've been able to bring behavior change principles from the UK and from your work internationally to the States. And now that you're back working full-time in the UK, really interesting to just stay in touch and be able to keep each other up to date on what's happening in both of our markets. So really excited for this discussion today.
Indeed. Thanks, Julia. That's great. So let's talk more. Let's get into TDM and let's start with just how would we define it? What do we mean by TDM? And as you know, there's so many interpretations, but put simply, I like to describe it as managing demand on the transport system by thinking about the people who use the system and providing those people with more choices. And those choices might be about what mode they're going to travel on, what time of day they might travel, or where they travel to, but only by connecting with the users and thinking about the users of the system and providing them with real choices can we really truly make the most efficient use of the system and not just keep building. Is that a fair summary, Julia, or what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think definitely, that captures sort of the high level overview of what we try to do with TDM and what we're hoping to get out of it. I think I'd add, when it comes down to actually implementing TDM or delivering it, lots of those choices are really created by making sure that people understand what their options are. And that's what we do a lot in sort of the day-to-day of TDM delivery. So, building a bike lane or establishing a new bus route is a form of TDM, but so is sort of the marketing and the outreach behind it or any incentivization around using those choices. And so if people don't know they exist, they're not going to get used. And that's what we tend to see from the behavior change standpoint is beyond just creating the choices. How can we make them more attractive and how can we make sure that people are making the choices that are best for them and help us reach the goals that we're trying to achieve with TDM.
That's so very true, isn't it? The education and the encouragement to do something different is fundamental. It reminds me actually of when we do some of our motivational interviewing type training, and we always talk to people about the fact that for the majority of people who aren't transport planners, the idea of really giving a lot of thought to how they make their trips and why they make their trips is just not something people do. It's a real habit to walk out of the door every morning and perhaps be carrying the car keys because that's all you've ever done. And why would you stop and look up what your public transport route is, or indeed how you might bike somewhere? So such an important part of what we do in TDM is about really making people stop and think and understand that actually there are other ways to get around and do the things they need to do. So let's think now about the drivers of TDM. And I suppose they're thinking about the differences a little bit between the United Kingdom and the United States. Why have different governments pursued TDM? And I've been in this industry a lot longer than you are. I'm a lot older than you are in that sense. And when I think back to when I started working in TDM in the UK, the biggest driver was absolutely congestion. Everything we were doing was around reducing the number of car trips, which were creating congestion on our roadways. And I remember in particular, I look back at some of what at the time was really groundbreaking work that the Department for Transport here funded for a Sustainable Travel Towns programme back in 2004. It was a demonstration project, and 3 towns, different parts of the UK, were given a £10 million fund, a lot of money at that time, to implement what we called Smarter Choices programmes, typically TDM type measures, over a 5-year period. And all 3 of those towns put in a range of initiatives aimed at encouraging more use of non-car options, in particular bus, cycling, walking, and to absolutely discourage single occupancy car use. That was our main goal. And the evaluation of that showed a reduction of 7 to 10% reduction in the number of car driver trips per resident, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time that we could put in this type of program of initiatives. But it was absolutely the car driver trips we were focused on measuring. And I think now that's changed a little bit. I think air quality sure has always been important and the environmental impact of car driver trips. But I think transport's role in achieving net zero has just really moved the debate on now. And it's much more important for local transport authorities and indeed private and public organisations to be thinking about how they're working towards their own net zero goals. And then just as a third aside, I suppose, new development has always been there. And that was there 20, 30 years ago, and it's still there today, that the opportunity for new developments coming forwards gives the local planning authority the opportunity often to require things that we might associate with TDM. So how does that compare to the drivers in the US, and how's that perhaps changed over time?
Yeah, I think in the States there have been some similar trends. Historically, our TDM policy and programming has really flowed down from sort of an environmental standpoint and also a congestion reduction standpoint as well. Post-COVID, we've seen that shift a little bit away from congestion, as congestion has just gotten harder to control. It's not all happening at the same time anymore. It's a bit less predictable. And so focusing on the environment is something that we've seen come through a bit more clearly in US policy and drivers. I think in particular, we know that the transportation sector contributes to about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's an area that's really important for us to focus on. And I think the other piece you mentioned, developers, I think is sort of coming from the private sector and thinking about the options and the choices that you mentioned a few minutes ago and how important they are to actual day-to-day travelers. And so in addition to just congestion reduction or air quality, TDM is used as a tool to make things easier for people who are getting around. And that's something that developers want to see because they want their projects to be attractive to tenants. Employers want to see because they want their work sites to be accessible and they want to be able to provide benefits to their employees. And so we see a lot of that TDM, particularly from the private sector, coming around just wanting to be competitive and provide good service to the people who need to get around.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point on the workplace trying to be competitive as well, right? It's not actually just a planning condition or a sustainability goal, but it's also so key to the recruitment and retention.
Exactly. And post-COVID, I think that's become even more important as just employment has become more competitive.
Okay, so similar drivers in both places, which is not surprising, I guess. Let's move on a bit now to funding, where I think we do see some really very real differences. And in the UK, I highlighted that Sustainable Travel Towns program in the early 2000s, and that led to the success of those programs, led to a really good period of sustained local sustainable transport fund, we called it, but it was available for local authorities across the country to be implementing TDM. That drew to a close, and now we're in a place where we have a much more pro motorists agenda. We have a much more constrained funding environment, and the funding that is coming forward for local transport authorities is far more perhaps to fund capital projects and that sort of important revenue funding we need to do the smarter choices work, the education, the encouragement is much harder to come by. I'm hoping, of course, that will change in the coming years, but that's the environment we're in today. So how would you characterize the funding environment in the US and how that's changed?
Yeah, I think in the US, Lisa, we're, a little bit more friendly towards funding TDM from a federal perspective. We've had the CMAQ, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, that's existed in the states, that TDM has been an allowable use for that program for years. And so that's funded lots of our TDM work across the states since I think the late 80s. That passes down through state governments to regional governments and local governments as well, and so really funds a whole variety of different types of TDM programming and strategies. And more recently, TDM has become a bit more well known from a federal government perspective as well, which is really great to see. Just in 2022, the carbon reduction program, which we've seen come through the federal government, listed TDM in its fact sheet as an option for funding emission reduction programs. And so it's really exciting to see, not only more funding come through for emission reduction and air quality programs, which we mentioned already as a driver, but seeing TDM really recognized as a tool in the toolkit. So we're not just seeing these programs fund huge infrastructure projects, but it's how are we thinking about TDM in addition to some of those larger projects that are coming through those funding sources.
That's amazing. That would be a great place to get to. Do you think that was a long time coming? Do you think there's a change of heart at the federal level to recognize TDM, or did it just take time to really develop the prominence of it?
I think it's certainly something that took time, and I think it's all back to kind of behavior change and recognition of how important some of these things are, right? We in the US have the Association for Commuter Transportation, which is a professional and advocacy organization really fully dedicated to supporting transportation demand management. And so we've been able to really use the tools that are in their toolbox to get in touch with our policymakers and make sure that they understand what transportation demand management is. And so that's something that, has come through a really dedicated effort. But I think at the same time, there's also been just more of a general understanding, maybe even if not of TDM and what transportation demand management is, but from the general public of why it's important to make a change in your behavior, to make a choice to use a more sustainable mode. And, that comes through both our governments, but also just more of our, trending in behavior or in caring more about the environment in general, and sort of seeing that come through everything that we're consuming in the States as well.
Yeah, so true. Great. Well, then there's hope that that same swell of public opinion might get through here too. Thinking about other funds, so I remember probably when you and I were both in LA, I might need to be reminded of what that date was when the local Measure M funding came forward in California, well, within Los Angeles County itself. And I remember it was actually on the ballot paper locally that residents could opt in to pay an extra cent of sales tax on everything they might purchase, and that money would go towards transportation. And indeed, that's provided such a massive local fund for local projects. And I think it really impressed me for two reasons. One, that a process like that could exist, because it doesn't in the UK, but also that the huge majority of people that had to vote for that measure for it to go forward recognized the importance of investing in transportation and how it would help them get around.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that we've been able to see in some parts of the states. Of course, it's not everywhere, but we certainly have seen more jurisdictions take on, we call them sort of self-help tax programs, where the community is voting to impose either a sales tax, or in some cases we see vehicle registration fees that create programs dedicated to supporting congestion reduction activities or transportation specifically. So it's different in every location, but it's definitely, I think that goes back to the culture we're seeing of people understanding the importance of some of this stuff. They know they're going to need to get around in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and that they need options to do that. And so, that education is hugely important in making sure that those programs and those funding structures exist. And it's great to see sort of TDM be able to be a beneficiary of those programs rather than just the huge infrastructure projects themselves. And so seeing both community members and local governments really tie the two together has been really exciting in the States in the past few years.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, let's talk about strategy, shall we? And I think when we worked together in the States, we always talked about the importance of having that experience of having worked across both strategy and implementation, that really informed the other. The fact that we were able to write better strategies because we really had that experience on the ground in implementing different projects in different environments, and that really informed the development of a better strategy. But really, what I take away from the strategy is it helps the authority go forward and think about what that program of implementation will look like. It gives them a structure to work to and really develops the specific projects they might want to take forward in the future, which makes it easier for any staff member coming forward to sort of pick that project up and deliver it, because it's been put within a structure and an overall framework. But you're busy right now, I think, working with a number of different agencies on TDM strategies. What are you seeing of the benefits of them working on those?
Yeah, I think developing a strategy is really hugely important to implementing TDM, particularly at sort of a local, regional level. We are often asked what works and what strategies should be used. And, there's really not a one size fits all answer to that, right? We understand that certain strategies work better with certain audiences. It depends on what your transportation landscape looks like and what the options that exist are. And so, the benefit of developing a strategy is really making sure that the tools that are being put in your toolkit, as you mentioned, Lisa, that you can then pull back into and use to guide your delivery as you move forward, are really tailored to the folks that you want to be serving and really built around being most successful with your audiences. And so I think that that's one of the major benefits of putting together a strategy before you're just starting programming, because you don't want to build something that isn't going to work. I think the other piece that we tend to really prioritize at Steer in our projects is making sure that our strategies are built around monitoring processes. And so not only are we saying, based on who your audience is, here's what probably will work the best and here's what you should try. It's here's what you should try and here's how you should measure and really understand if it is successful in the long term. We talked a little bit about TDM back in the 80s and 90s, and lots of that was really focused on just delivering programs, but there was less of an understanding of how successful it really was. And today, I think the industry has moved toward being a bit more, self-evaluating and really understanding as we go what's working and what's not, because it makes us able to make changes on the go. It makes it easier for us to, make little tweaks to the programs that we're putting forward so that we're able to keep them successful. The landscape is always changing, audience needs are changing. And so just assuming something that works, in 2024 is going to work again in 2034 doesn't really make sense. We want to be able to kind of stay on top of that. And that all comes through sort of designing a strategy first so that you're making sure you're keeping track of how things are working and monitoring your progress.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. It's agile. The landscape we're working in is changing so much. The transportation options are changing so much. But actually, the other thing we've seen is the marketing tools that are coming forward that we're able to utilize. And even if we just think about how social media has changed over the last 10 years, means actually our communication methods can be so different. And we've really got to be keeping on top of all of that. Just thinking again about strategies and reflecting on some of the work I've been involved in there, I was thinking of the importance of winning hearts and minds of the stakeholders involved. So if I go back to the very first project actually I worked on in the States for Sandag, an agency, I have a lot of respect for the great work they do. And it was designing a TDM strategy for the North Coast corridor that was going to mitigate the impacts of really quite large scale construction they had planned on the I-5 and indeed the rail corridor at the same time. And it was just really interesting taking the time to look ahead to 2040 in this case in that construction program, but really engaging many stakeholders who were involved in that construction who weren't involved day to day, if you like, in TDM. They didn't have knowledge of TDM. There was really an education piece for us, I suppose, to help those people understand the value of TDM and why it should become part of their construction projects. And I think that's something else I'd say about the benefits of really developing a good comprehensive TDM strategy is taking stakeholders with you, having the opportunity to build the understanding and appreciation of what TDM, when properly deployed, can really achieve. And I think you've worked on some other strategies. If I think of the one we did together for SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, which was far more widespread over a much, much bigger area, wasn't it? But we really had to engage those stakeholders across those different counties. Do you think that's then led to better implementation of TDM by those different counties? I remember going to somewhere there was just really low levels of awareness and understanding of TDM when we started. And I wonder how you've seen that change.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, particularly at the local level where people are just really busy and city workers have lots on their plates, TDM is maybe not something that they're thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And being able to pull them into a strategy development process is huge, because not only are you saying, here's something exciting that you could use if you want to. It's, what's important to you and how can TDM be designed in a way that actually does work best for you. And so it's probably not unique to TDM. It's probably something we see across lots of our planning processes as transportation planners in general. But, the more we're able to pull stakeholders into decision-making processes and the more we're able to give them a say in the way that strategies and recommendations ultimately get developed, I think the more they're learning from them, the more they're ultimately going to be able to prioritize the types of strategies that we'd want them to be using. And so definitely pulling those folks in is really important. And I think, even beyond just local governments, it's developers and employers as well. It's business and community leaders. It's folks who have sort of that influence, because in TDM in particular, we as practitioners don't usually have access to every single person traveling. And so it's really, really important to make sure that these stakeholders, if they care about some of the drivers that we've discussed already, air quality, congestion reduction, that they understand why TDM can help with those things and why it's important. And so they can translate some of those behavior change ideas down to the people that they're working with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Okay, so strategy is important, but actually it's only really effective if it leads to that implementation. We've engaged and educated those stakeholders, and it leads to some TDM implementation on the ground. So let's talk a bit more about some of the projects we've worked on and the way we've really been able to make a difference to the communities we've worked in, and think about what's made those projects effective. And there's such a range to choose from. Where might we go first?
Good question. We've done lots of different types of work in different places. Maybe one that I'll start with is, and Lisa, I think you were involved at the very beginning of this work we did up in Napa Valley in California, where we had been working with MTC, the regional agency, to try to reduce congestion along there. It's Highway 29, sort of main corridor where there are lots of vineyards and hospitality type employers, really trying to make sure that we can get their employees to work, and their employees are folks who work often in either hospitality or agriculture, so might not have like regular 9 to 5 schedules that we're traditionally seeing in TDM. And so we had to think creatively about kind of how to get those employers on board and how to develop a program that would work well for their employees and try to reduce and relieve some of the congestion along the corridor. So originally, pre-COVID, we were thinking about things like carpooling and how to incentivize it and get folks to share rides. And then in the middle of that, COVID happened, and that wasn't something we wanted to be prioritizing for people anymore. And so we really shifted to thinking about e-bikes and e-scooters and micromobility as sort of a way for folks to get around easily and safely. And so we put together an e-bike incentive program pilot. This is last summer and fall, I guess, July 2022. And one of the things we were able to see, which was really great, is that by giving folks access to e-bikes and e-scooters, so cheaper cost to purchasing or renting these vehicles, we actually saw people change their behavior. So we saw 75 people who took us up on the program and were able to get a bike or a scooter out of the program. And we also saw behavior change. We surveyed folks and were able to see a real change in people who would have been driving, but we're now using these e-bikes for commuting purposes. And so, just a small sample size because we were only working with a handful of employers, but one of the sort of post-COVID implementation projects that we have under our belt most recently, that's been really great to see the long-term change in sort of getting these bikes and scooters into people's hands.
Amazing. And you're right. I was involved in the very early stages of that project. And one of the characterizations was, it's a very rural area and the distances people were commuting were very far. So that's great, actually, that an e-bike was able to transfer to that. Were they loans or were they some form of purchase? Did they loan the bike for a period of time? Or?
We actually offered a little bit of both. Most people ended up purchasing, but the vendor we were working with did also offer loans. And I think actually since that program, the other clients that they work with are now more focused on leasing the vehicles at a monthly basis versus purchasing them. But our Napa program ended up with lots of folks who do now own the vehicles and can use them forever, which is really great to see.
Wow, fantastic. Leaves a real legacy. We're just doing a lot of data analysis actually we've been doing the monitoring and evaluation of the Department for Transport's national e-bike program here as a pilot program. And that across 4 different locations in the UK gave out e-bikes primarily as loans, well, always as loans, but 3 different settings. So actually you could either go into a bike store and get one, or it tested giving out loans to a community setting, or indeed maybe a workplace or education setting. And we're just doing the analysis and reporting on that now. But I have to say our interim findings in the summer were really encouraging, actually, about the potential for e-bikes to really make a difference on that commuting piece and indeed other journeys. So excited to see these new modes coming into the sphere and how actually we use TDM to do that education and encouragement piece around helping people understand how to access those new modes.
Yeah, I think it's really great to see sort of the encouragement and the education come together at the same time. A lot of our TDM programs are about incentivization, so providing discounted transit passes or providing things like e-bikes, and being able to use that carrot, we like to call it, as a tool to get people to try something for the first time is great because they're at the same time, even though they may not know it, really learning about how to use a new mode that they haven't tried before. And so, being able to tie in the education of how to use a new mode or how it works with we're going to make it a little bit sweeter for you and make it free or give you an extra benefit for it is fun to see, and something that we do see people pick up pretty frequently.
Yeah. Thinking about new modes, I was also thinking it's how we can apply those to existing modes too, and actually staying in that roughly that geography. I was reminded of the project we did for the Livermore Amador Valley Transit Authority, where we were asked to help them increase the number of bus riders in their local community in and around Pleasanton. And they had a particular issue that they were serving the local BART station, and the car park there was very full, and they obviously had their buses running and the opportunity to increase ridership. And we introduced the concept of reaching out to all of the residents in the area with information and to some extent incentives, but largely information about what that bus service was and how they could ride that. And one of the exciting things for me was that they measured the effectiveness of that through boardings onto the bus. And we were actually able to measure a real difference in the number of people riding the bus in their service area through that education and encouragement. So yeah, it's important we think it's not just about new modes, right? It can also be really effective at getting people onto those more older and traditional modes that are still serving people's journeys. Okay, other great projects that we've worked on. I'm interested in the TMOs. I mean, that's something you've done a lot of work with, Julia, in different places across the states, and the effectiveness of them in working across an area and bringing businesses together.
Yeah, we at Steer manage a handful of transportation management associations or transportation management organizations, TMAs or TMOs, we call them. And they all work a little bit differently, but really the similarity between them all is that they're working with a handful of sites, whether that's employers or universities or development projects, to help provide TDM services to the folks who are using those sites. And so, like I mentioned a little bit before, it's tough to get that, individual one-on-one behavior change conversation unless we're doing something like we did up in Livermore, where we're knocking on doors and talking to individuals. But obviously that's, pretty time intensive. And so what we like to see, and why TMAs and TMOs are so great, is because they're able to sort of be a convener of all of these different, again, whether it's work sites or development projects or residential projects, to help one key individual, two key individuals at each site be able to translate some of those programs down to the people that they're talking to on a daily basis. So rather than the TMA or TMO needing to speak to every traveler in the city, they're able to speak to, we typically call them transportation coordinators or whoever that sort of dedicated site representative is, really get them involved in the programs that the TMA or the TMO is offering, really make sure that they have a really good understanding of transportation options in the area, and that they're able to translate that down to their user base and the folks who are using their sites. And we've actually done in Santa Monica a little bit of research in sort of comparing how engaged our transportation coordinators are and how that translates to actual individualized behavior. And what we've seen is that when we have those site coordinators really involved in the TMA and the TMO, when they're attending events, when they're reading our newsletters, when they're participating in our programs, those sites have better numbers of non-single occupancy drivers than the ones where the coordinators aren't as engaged. And so it's really cool to see that flow down, and really demonstrates how useful these TMAs and TMOs can be if they're engaging the right way with the right people. And, using that sort of economies of scale, being able to get this huge number of travelers reached through this kind of flow down system.
the structure. And of course, there's some I know that you work with that are more workplace focused, but you mentioned Santa Monica, which is one, of course, that goes beyond the workplaces, and it's trying to reach residents and visitors to the city as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, particularly with multifamily residential buildings, we're able to take a similar approach where we're working with sort of an on-site coordinator who's making sure that the TDM programs offered by the TMO are advertised to their residents. But we also, in a lot of these situations, are working really closely with the local jurisdictions as well. So we manage a transportation management organization in Burbank, California, where while most of our members are employers, we do also work with the city to get messaging out to the general public. So we've done some really fun work with schools. We've done some really fun work with just hosting events that like the city's been able to push out on their communication channels. And we've been able to then interact with a larger audiences, including residents as well.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about the funding of some of those programs. And Santa Monica, I think, and maybe still is, was free. Anyone could benefit from the services of the TMO with no cost, whereas some do have a small membership fee that the workplace perhaps might pay each year.
Yeah, so some of them are operated through the public sector directly, and Santa Monica is a really great example of that, where they are the TMO is fully funded by the city, and the TMO works with any employer that wants to work with them. And they get a lot of that engagement because there's some policy and regulation that employers do need to comply with in the city. In other cases, we also see TMAs and TMOs just as fully nonprofit organizations. So while often they have good relationships with the jurisdictions where they operate, they're not necessarily operated by or for the public agency. They're actually, nonprofit organizations managed by a board of directors that are made up of membership. So sometimes it's a group of developers or employers who are concerned about either the environment or congestion in an area kind of coming together and saying, this is something we really care about. What can we do to help make a change here? And that's how these organizations get established, really similar to business improvement districts or chambers of commerce, but just focused specifically on transportation.
Yeah, got it. I'm thinking of particular projects I'm working on in the UK now, where I think I've said that it feels like there's less TDM, the opportunity to implement a little bit less TDM at the moment, but some of the places I've enjoyed recently, in fact, are airports. So I do a part-time secondment to London City Airport here in the city, which has some really ambitious plans brought about both by its own sustainability plan and it's wanting to really make a difference in terms of sustainable aviation, but also through development conditions. So we are working towards some pretty ambitious targets on reducing the number of staff coming to the site by car and increasing the number of passengers who are coming to the site by public transport. So those are our two goals there. And I think in the period I've been working there, it's really been a focus on having people understand it's less about the infrastructure changes, which are the bigger things, the more expensive things, and they take time. But actually, we can make a really big difference with that communication, the education, the encouragement that we keep coming back to. And we set up a brand at the airport last year, Way to Work, and we've been keeping up sort of weekly communications around that and doing some roadshows and having prize giveaways and a monthly car share draw and so forth. And we're really pleased with the recent staff survey results, which shows that we had reduced a 4 percentage point reduction in the number of staff driving alone over the past year. And that really has come down to that I think communication and just awareness raising, not being a big topic at the airport until we really decided to set this identity of it up and really start talking to people about what we were trying to do and why we wanted to change. But we don't have that network, of course, that the TMAs would bring us. But
yeah, and we do see TMAs and TMOs that are focused specifically on one business park, for example, or, a really small area versus like a whole city footprint. And so, when you're thinking about the UK and who might be interested in developing programs like that, that could be an interesting place to look because there are, again, from the developer side, maybe more drivers than there are at the sort of city or jurisdictional level as well.
Cool. We are talking, and I think there's a couple of other areas I thought we should explore before we wrap up. So let's move on to them. And I guess again, keeping thinking about how TDM can really make a difference in the climate emergency we're in at the moment. I wonder how we think about how TDM practitioners keep progressing the field and keep innovating. We touched on it a bit earlier that we need to keep in touch with those marketing techniques and how they change over time. But what supporting networks and opportunities do we see? And I think if I highlight one first, it's the importance of just sharing what's working, right? Best practice, and how do we make sure we're constantly telling people about those great projects that really do work? And I've always really appreciated that TDM listserv that you have in the States, which is such a good articulation of people either looking for best practice or indeed sharing it and finding it. And I was excited last year here in the UK to hear that an influencing transport laboratory has been set up. It's currently being housed by Transport for the West Midlands, but their ambition is to become that centre of excellence in the UK. And importantly, I think to bridge the gap between academics who are doing so much good work in this field and practitioners to help try and link that conversation together. What do you see as really key in how we keep innovating and moving forwards?
I think, yeah, that's a huge, huge important concept, Lisa, and one that you can speak to yourself in terms of the, some of the tactic and the knowledge that you brought over from the UK back in 2012, 2014. And so I think that's something that needs to continue happening. And, agencies like the Association for Commuter Transportation, which is technically an international organization, though I know it's sort of US and Canada focused for the most part, really help with some of that knowledge sharing. I think some of the other things that are really key when we're thinking about moving the industry forward is thinking about data collection and making sure that we're advocating for ourselves as an industry and really demonstrating the impact that TDM has. And so being able to make sure that the programs that we're putting forward are not just successful, but that we're really tracking and monitoring that success is hugely important, and then making sure that we're sharing that knowledge back and across our networks is really the only way to make sure that it's an industry that continues to see investment and continues to see some of the growth and excitement that we've seen in the previous 10, 15 years, I think. So that's something that I would probably focus on in terms of really prioritizing as we move forward in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, so true. You recently, you mentioned the Association of Commuter Transportation, and I know they recently really worked hard to introduce, I forget the name of the qualification, but there is now a TDM qualification that practitioners can work towards.
Yes, there is. And it's exciting to see. Again, it just sort of, legitimizes the industry and makes it a bit more noticeable across practitioners in general planning fields. And it's been exciting to see that program grow.
And maybe policymakers too, right? Maybe that's why you are having that success even at the federal level of raising that awareness and the opportunity for TDM to really make a difference. So, okay, before we wrap up, let's just think. We've talked a lot about the past and the present, but let's focus a little bit more on the future. And given the net zero by 2050 target and concerns over public health and the relative lag in reducing transport emissions, TDM could play a huge role. And what would you like to see most looking forward?
Great question. I think more TDM is really what we want to see, and so as we're thinking about the future and how we're implementing TDM, I think we've touched on lots of it today, but more of that sort of thinking strategically, more of that learning from the on the ground work to be able to really smartly apply it to the unique situations where we're all operating, I think is really key. And ensuring that the programs and the policy and the funding that allows for TDM really leaves room for that, so that we're not designing funding programs that are too specific, that don't allow for really tailored programming or education services, that we're allowing our practitioners to continue to collect really good data through pilots that then gets pulled back into the new work that's coming through, and just leaving room for more innovation and the ability to continue to learn from the work that we're doing.
Yeah. And that's what makes it so exciting to work in, right? That opportunity for that innovation and keep learning. It doesn't grow tired. I think when I think about the UK, what I'd like to see is I'd like to, if you like, get back to the heyday of more TDM. And I think if I think of all the great focus that's perhaps been around more on our current round of local transport plans that local transport authorities across the country are developing, and there's some really great vision-led planning going into those. I'd just like to see some of the TDM elements that are perhaps forming some parts of those plans be brought to life a little bit more, to be further developed in really what they're thought, and to work with stakeholders, as we talked earlier on, understanding the important role that TDM can play in those plans. And I think by setting up that structure, that framework for TDM to come forward in the UK, then perhaps we can see more funding coming its way and just really start moving the needle and encouraging people out of cars. I have to say, we've not talked about electric vehicles, amazingly. I talk about those a lot these days. And I do think there's a real opportunity as we're progressing towards providing the infrastructure and the support for people to move to electric vehicle charging, to make sure that we're also communicating with them about other modes, so that actually there's a TDM opportunity there to encourage EV drivers to still be multimodal when it makes sense to be, and to remember to use other modes of transport as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think sort of making sure that we're not separating out the drivers that we've talked about is really key there, right? So we're not, if we're just focused on the environment, then switching everyone to an electric vehicle will have the same impact as keep switching everyone onto a bus, but we'll all be stuck in traffic all the time. And so making sure that we're sort of pulling these drivers in together, so that we understand the education can all come at the same time, and we can prioritize more than one thing at once, is really helpful in that.
So true. All right. Well, I think we should wrap it up there. It's been great talking to you. We talk often anyway and share the different stuff we're doing in different places, but it's been really good to air this and share that with a few more people. So thank you so much, Julia, for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks, Lisa. This has been really fun. I appreciate hearing more about what you all are focused on in the UK, and it's been great to talk a little bit more formally about all of it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.